Right. We'll start. Well, welcome Society members and guests, to everyone for coming this afternoon. We have special thanks to General and Mrs. Head, who have come the furthest. Right. Also members of the Aviation Historical Society, Three Squadron Association, sorry, the Roosevelt Services Club and the Western Front Association. And I should say, at the end of the talk this afternoon, if anyone thinks, well, first of all, we're aviation, that sounds interesting, don't hesitate to join us. But before we move on to the talk, a little bit of society business. Now and again, a society member does something that seems above and beyond that normally expected of a society member in the course of their membership. And last year, Steve Drew did something like that by donating his library, quite an extensive library, to the society. So it was a decision by the committee to present Steve with our very first Certificate of Merit.
So now I know what all the secrecy was about.
That's why you couldn't see it.
Give me a look, No.
Right,
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Back to the main theme. As you know, we're very privileged to have Brigadier General Head with us today to discuss his recent book on the life and times of Hauptmann Oswald Boelcke, arguably the man who taught the world how to fight in the air. And General Head is especially qualified to speak on the subject, being a distinguished airman with much flying experience, including operational experience. Now, it's a little difficult for me to properly introduce the speaker when I only met the man a couple of hours ago. So in that, I'll defer to someone who knows Brigadier General Head much better than myself, Dr. Carol Head.
It's so nice to be in Australia. I never believed I would ever get to Australia, so I'm so happy to be here. And I'm going to share 3 stories about RJ before he talks, so you get to know him a little bit better. The first story is when he was in Vietnam, and he was flying the A-1 Skyraider. Now, he's flying, and a bunch of photographers from NBC were there also, sitting on the runway, watching an F-5 do touch and goes, because the United States wanted the Vietnamese to buy these F-5s. So they had the photographers there. Now, RG is flying around, and he can't get his landing gear down on the A-1 Skyraider. So he calls the tower and says, I can't get my landing gear down. And the tower said, go and drop your bombs in the ocean. We'll foam the runway. So now the photographers hear this, and they thought watching a crash landing would be much more fun than doing the touch and go. So they run over and they set up their cameras on the runway. So now let me go back a minute. What I usually say is the first time I ever saw RG was on the Ed Sullivan show. And I don't know if you ever saw Ed Sullivan. Anybody ever saw Ed Sullivan? It used to be the #1 TV program that everybody watched. They had Elvis, and they had the Beatles, and they had RG. And this is, so the photographers are waiting there with their cameras on the runway, and they start taking his picture. So on the Ed Sullivan Show, you see this A1 coming in, hitting the runway, sparks are flying like crazy, and then hitting the foam, and the sparks go out. And then you see this adorable little captain jumping out of the cockpit and running like crazy, and just happened to run right into the photographers, or he didn't know they were there. So Ed Sullivan heard about this and wanted this clip. And so not only that, but the A1 is an old Navy plane, and it had a tail hook. So not only did RG carefully land this A1, but he put the tail hook down and caught the cable. So this is all shown on the Ed Sullivan Show, and then they invited RG to come and stand in the audience, and then they introduced RG, and he stood up while they told all how wonderful he was, and where his parents were, where he was born, and everything. And so I happened to see that. It was in 1966. And if you saw Nancy Sinatra singing "Her Boots Are Made for Walking," if you did, then you saw RG. You didn't even know. Here you're going to meet him. All these years be just like me, where I didn't, never dreamed I'd meet him. And 30 years later is when I met him. So anyway, that's his first story, which I think is just really wonderful. That I fell in love with this captain when he jumped out of his cockpit. So the second story I want to tell you, I call the good news, bad news story. RG was working in the Pentagon, he's a full colonel, and he was working for a 3-star general, and he was a secretary of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had a big time job. One day, General Dalton called him in and said, "RG, I've got good news for you. First of all, you've been promoted to Brigadier General, and secondly, you get to go to Avion, Italy. You're going to be head of the Air Force, NATO, in Italy. You're going to live in a big villa, you're going to have a chaperone car, and you're just going to have, it'd be so wonderful for you." But now the bad news. The bad news is that, yes, he lived in a villa, but was surrounded by barbed wire. He had a chauffeur limousine, but it was a big orange Mercedes with holes on the side where they put the machine guns out. Now, why was this? Because he was being replaced by a kidnapped General Dozier, who had been kidnapped by the Red Brigade and was being held captive. And he had to replace him. So he had, yes, he had Carabinieri. They followed him everywhere, sort of like the Secret Service, those days. And followed him everywhere, and so he got to be over there, but he was watched like a hawk. And I believe the general finally did get released. They went in and did a big, probably it was the SEALs, probably went in and got him, but whatever, finally got him out alive. But so that was the good news, bad news story that I think is really good for RG. The third story is my girlfriend said to me, "Carol, why would RG write a book about a German? What is this? Why is this?" You're probably all wondering too. But here's the story on that. We lived 3 blocks away from the yacht club. And so RG and I joined the yacht club when we moved there, and RG bought a sailboat, and he's now flying his sailboat. And so we were pretty active in the yacht club. So they asked RG if he would be the Commodore of the yacht club, and he was very honored, said yes. Now, his boat actually has a big red hull, so everybody was calling him the Red Baron because he had this big red hull, and they knew he was a fighter pilot. So at the end of the year, you're a Commodore, you have to put on a big Commodore's ball. So all the women that wanted to decorate came to him and said, "RG, we want to name it the Red Baron Ball. We think that'd be perfect for you. So RG, we would like you to build a 6-foot wingspan Red Baron airplane to float over the dance floor." So RG, "Oh, okay." So RG, "All right, I'll do it." So he went to the hobby shop and he bought the little kits you could buy, a little Red Baron airplane kit, and he put it together, and then he blew up the instructions like 6 times so that he'd have it big enough, and he made this really wonderful airplane that floated above the dance floor. It was really fun and cute. But now, we live in a very small house, so there's no place to put an airplane in the house. So where was he going to put it? So that, well, maybe San Diego Air and Space Museum at Balboa Park. Have any of you ever been there? Have you? Okay. He thought maybe they would take it, but no, they already have a real one. They don't need that. So it landed in the library. And we have this amazing library in Coronado, and it now floats above the children's section. And if you're ever in Coronado and you drive down Orange Avenue, which is the main street, and you look over to your right at the library, you could see the airplane floating above the children's section, right up in the from the street. So, but this gave RG, that was so much fun to build that he thought, gosh, I'd really like to build a museum quality airplane that Air and Space Museum will actually take. So he went to the museum, and he talked to the curator and said, what would you take? I'll build anything you say. Which one would you like me to build? So they looked through their books, and they said, well, okay, we don't have this Albatross D2 German, World War I German airplane. We don't have that. So if you build it, we'll put it in the museum. So, okay, so RG, so excited. So he starts building this airplane, and now it's 6 foot wingspan airplane. And so now he's so excited, and he took just meticulous care about how he did every single thing, because he knew it was going in a museum, and much different than having something for a party. So he started building this airplane, and then he heard, well, as he did research, this airplane has a wing named, the pilot who flew this airplane was this very famous World War I pilot. He'd never heard of it. I'd never heard of it. He'd never heard of it. And it still have a wing in the Luftwaffe named after this pilot. And so, of course, he writes the wing. Tell me about the plane. I'm building this plane. Can you tell me anything? And about 3 months later, it took them to return. And they said, well, come out and see it. Come and see our wing and everything. So we were so excited to do that. And so that for 2 summers, RG and I decided we wanted to take summer school at Oxford in England. You could take a week-long summer school. And so for 2 different summers, we would go to Oxford and take this fun little, he did Battle of Britain was one of his, mine was Jane Eyre, we took and then we got on the train and we went to Luftwaffe and saw this wonderful wing named Oswald Boelcke. And so so he got more research as he's building the plane, and then we get fascinated by this pilot. This pilot was absolutely adorable and so human and so caring. We just loved him. And RG sent to England to have a pilot, a doll made to go into the airplane. So that when that doll came from England, we opened the box, I couldn't believe it. He had sandy blonde hair, blue eyes, kind of a slim build. I thought it was a reincarnation of RG. I mean, he looked exactly like it. So anyway, so we, he did more and more research on him and on the plane. And I'll have RG tell you about all the meticulous things he did for this airplane, because they finally said to him about a year into it, we want the left side open so we can see all the instruments. Well, first of all, he had to blow up the model instructions to even build it. Now they wanted the instruments, of which, couldn't be the same size as instruments, all had to be little bitty instruments. So he'll tell you more about that. But anyway, so he builds it, and we have a big party at the Air and Space Museum. We invite all of our friends, we brought champagne. Oh, he's going to put his airplane in the museum and everything, and it was a great big party. And by the way, it's under plexiglass It is the most beautiful plane in the whole museum. I invite you to come, and if you come to Coronado and sail in a sailboat. So that's pretty good. So anyway, now after the plane's in, you know, he'd been working, you know, day and night making this plane perfect. So he has kind of postpartum depression, you know, what women get after they have a baby, you know, because now, what am I going to do? So what am I going to do? I'm so, I said, RG, here was stacked of books of research all over the house. I said, RG, write the book. So he sits down, writes the book, he had all the research, and he sends it to London, and London publishes it immediately. And so then they said, come to London for the publishing party. So we went to London, we went all over with the publisher to the air shows. They have all these wonderful air shows in England, maybe probably Australia too. And so that's how this baby, this is RG's baby, this book, believe me, it's our baby. And that's how it happened that RG wrote this wonderful book about this amazing, the most amazing man. And even though he was a German, he really cared about the English and the French. And you know, if you read the book, you know the story, RG will tell you. So now I am presenting you with my adorable husband, Brigadier General RG Head.
Thank you, sweetie. That's a wonderful introduction. It is such a pleasure. We are so honored to be here. I want to make sure I'm not carrying German coal to Newcastle because you are the real historians and you're the first real historian group that we've spoken to. It's just a great, absolutely great honor to be here. Thank you for the lunch. We've been working on getting this arrangement for over a year, and Gareth has just done a wonderful job, and I thank all of you. I'm so glad that you are researching and becoming more knowledgeable in World War I. I grew up reading mostly, actually, the books I was reading, although it was during World War II, the books were all about World War I because they were written in the 20s and 30s. So a lot of my reading was about these brave guys, these pioneers flying these kites, wood and fabric airplanes. But it's really wonderful to learn this really was the Great War. And as you know, it changed virtually everything. Monarchies fell across Europe. It invalidated the legitimacy of the upper class, I think especially in England, because England's such a stratified society. And I think the worker, I think that's why Labour won after World War II. All these disenfranchised, dispirited workers, they were being captained by these officers raised in public schools, but they couldn't do anything in World War I. I mean, it just absolutely, trench warfare was just absolutely awful, and I think that hurt England quite a lot, in addition to the actual guys that were, so many were killed. It spawned the Russian Revolution. It sponsored the rapid rise of aviation, especially the increase in horsepower of the engines that were built from 1914 to 1918. It led to the enfranchisement of women. American women got the vote, I think, the year after, I think also in Britain, I think about the same time. So it really led to a whole change of the social order. In addition to which, we lost 8 million young men. Just absolutely incredible on all sides. In America, it led to prohibition, to an era of optimism, and the prohibition ladies primarily convinced the government that we should not be drinking alcohol. You know, very bad for you, right? Christian nation, not. Well, that didn't last too long, but it came out of World War I, and it was the last gasp of chivalry. I think there were chivalric events in World War II, but mostly in World War I. In fact, Oswald Boelcke was fortunate in a sense to have died in 1916, because in 1917, 1918, it got much more, it got more bloody, and I think the the righteous elements of it kind of got washed away. Everyone became cynical, and the losses, of course, increased tremendously. Slide, please. Now, so why Oswald Boelcke? First of all, he was Germany's first ace, and I'm going to write an article shortly, Gareth, on comparing Oswald Boelcke and Max Immelmann, because there's this paradox about Max Immelmann being so much more famous than Oswald Boelcke. I went to the Air Force Academy and I never heard of Oswald Boelcke. Everybody knows Max Immelmann because this crazy Immelmann turn, which, by the way, it's very unlikely that Max ever flew a real Immelmann. He could not with the Eindecker, because you don't have the ailerons that you need on top to roll the airplane out. So it's probably something like a wing over, a chandelle with a wing over, for those of you that are pilots. And let me mention, by the way, I wrote this book from the pilot's point of view. So I was looking for the characteristics of the airplane, how big it was, how fast it was, firepower, what they thought of it, flying, and so I tried to infuse that in the book. First winner of the Blue Max, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the Blue Max. And of course, the movie made the term Blue Max quite famous. He had compassion for his victims. He was from a Christian family. He was the second son of the Lutheran pastor and minister in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The two older children, boy and a girl, were born in Argentina, and they moved back to Germany in about 1889, 1890, and Oswald was born in 1891. So he was born in Germany, but they had it was a religious family. Honored by the Royal Flying Corps, and I'll get into that. And he was, we believe, probably the most famous aviator in Europe in 1916. There were a couple of British aviators that were famous. There were no Americans, of course, because the Lafayette Escadrille had really not started. So we think, and I'll show you some, I did research on really how famous he was, and I'll share that with you. Slide, please. 5 January 1916. He's flying the Eindecker, the single-wing airplane that I'll show you in a minute. He shoots down his 7th victim, and I hope you have the same opinion of the British BE-2 that I do. The BE-2 was undoubtedly the worst airplane in the world to be flying in 1916. The artillery loved it, and the ground guys loved it because it was slow, reliable, and the observers could give a very good account of the artillery spotting on the ground. However, in 1915 and 16, when there became an air war, the BE-2 was absolutely the worst airplane. It was slow, it was not very maneuverable, and of course a lot of them got shot down, and in the book I detail quite a few of Oswald's victims, as well as Richthofen's, were BE-2s. So he shoots down this one, and and he lands beside the airplane they shot down. Of course, he shot down on the German side. Now, when you're landing at 40 miles an hour, there are a lot of places to land. And so he picked a place, sat down, went over to this, the picture of him sitting here, and he's looking at, and just absolutely fascinating here. He talked to the crew, again, a two-person crew. The pilot had been taken off to the hospital. He talks to the observer, his name is Frenelli, and Frenelli says, "Oh, we're so honored to be shot down by you, Max Immelmann." and Oswald says, "Well, I'm sorry, it's only Oswald Boelcke who shot you down." But he says to Lieutenant, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And he says, "Well, yes, I've written this letter to my squadron commander. Could you see that it gets delivered?" So Oswald says, "Sure, I'll take it," puts it in his pocket, flies back to his airdrome. Next day, puts it in a bag, flies over the British airdrome and drops it in a bag. And a picture of that letter is in the book. Oh. And then his squadron commander endorsed it and sent it on to his mother, So she would know that he was safe in prison camp. And that's one of the stories. So he had that feeling for compassion for his victims. Slide, please. Now, in October 1916, almost a year after this adventure with the British airplane, he gets killed in an air-to-air collision where the airplane went into a spin, and I'll tell you about the collision. He and his wingmen ran together because in those days they were flying a terrible formation. They somehow had the idea that if the leader would fly in front and then the wingmen would stack up, they could see better. The problem is when you stack up, if any of you know, when the leader turns, either smoothly or rough or quickly, you lose sight of him. There's no place for you to go. You don't know whether to go up or down, and that's exactly what happened. The wingman broke away, but when the wingman's wheel hit Boelcke's left wingtip, and the aileron came off, and both airplanes went into a spin. His wingman recovered, but his top wing came off after the aileron, and he crashed from about 10,000 feet. And so his air base was near Cambrai, and they had the service in the Cambrai Cathedral, which is shown here. Over 1,000 people attended his funeral in a combat zone. The bishop was not pleased. Catholic bishop of this cathedral in Cambrai. Not only was he a German aviator and the first German to be honored in this French Catholic cathedral, but he was Lutheran. Made it even worse. Now, this is the casket on the carriage, the artillery caisson, and Manfred von Richthofen carried his Ordensknesse. German tradition was that when a hero dies, they put his medals on a pillow, and Ordensknesse means medals pillow, and the best friend of the aviator carries this ahead of the coffin and carries it all the way in the parade to, in this case, from the cathedral to the railroad station. And let me just review for you a little bit what the Ordensknesse contain. Here's the blue max, called blue because of Prussian blue. The enamel is Prussian blue on it with the cross. Never awarded after World War I. When the empire fell, they retired the medal. No one in World War II ever got the blue max. And there were quite a few aviators, many of whom were enlisted men, enlisted pilots, who won the blue max. This is an Order of the Bear from one of the German states. Iron Cross second class. This is an actual historic Iron Cross second class with 1916 emblazoned on the second class. Iron Cross first class, and the Iron Cross first class is worn, well, first of all, the second class is worn here in the second buttonhole, and you only wear the medal on the day of award, and from then on they put the ribbon in the buttonhole. So you'll see German pictures, and that is ribbon's not the only thing there, but the first one there is that Iron Cross second class. Iron Cross first class goes on the left breast, just above the pilot's wings, and I'll show you the wings in a minute. Here are the German pilot's wings, and I have a larger for it. The only set of wings that I've found of all the nations that don't actually look like some kind of bird's wings. You know, the Royal Flying Corps already had wings, the Americans did, everybody did, but the Prussian pilot's wings are not actually wings. This is a Bavarian Order of meant for bravery, blue and white. This is a life-saving medal that he was awarded Prussian Life-Saving Medal. In August of 1916, he was walking around the town on a Sunday afternoon, and a French boy fell into the canal, and Oswald dived into the canal and saved this French boy's life. The family wanted to honor him with the French Croix de Guerre, the medal, right. The Prussians, of course, said no way, so they gave him the Prussian Life-Saving Medal. In later life, Oswald said this was the medal he was most proud of. It meant a lot to him. This is the Hohenzollern medal. Of course, the Hohenzollerns are the family of the emperor. And so the Hohenzollern medal was given to Oswald after 6 victories. And it became a virtual prerequisite for the Blue Max all later in the war. And when the number of victories went up from 8 to 12 and finally ended up, I think, at 25, the Hohenzollern was just a few victories below that. This one you won't see very often. It's the Ottoman Turks Medal for Bravery, which he was given, I'll go over the summer of 1916. He went on an inspection trip to Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, and the Pasha gave him this gift. And this one, I don't believe you've ever seen. This is the Gallipoli Victory Medal, which the Pasha gave him as a result of the Turkish victory at the Battle of Gallipoli. I've never seen that in a British museum. So, and we all know what a cock up that one. So, that's what happened here, 31st of October. Now, they took the case on, and we have a longer version of it that wended its way all the way through the town to the railroad station. They put it on a railroad car, and it went its way through from eastern France through western Germany all the way to his hometown. And no kidding, people came out and stood alongside the railroad tracks as this would go by. In America, it reminds us of the way that Abraham Lincoln was honored when he was assassinated, and they took his body from Union Station in Washington, D.C. to back to Springfield, Illinois, where he is now buried. So he was already famous at that time. Slide, please. Now, this is part of his legacy, and the reason that we know that he was so famous. The Royal Flying Corps sent a lieutenant, always a lieutenant, over the funeral, and he dropped this wreath and sent this letter along with it on His Majesty's service. We are very honored to be able to honor his service, and to our brave and chivalrous opponent. Can you imagine that? I mean, he was famous enough, and with the things that he had done about, not only did he send that one letter, but later in his career, in the next 6 months, he would regularly send a list of those British pilots that had been shot down and had either died, were buried with honors, or were in hospital, or were in prisoner of war camp. And that information he would have dropped on the British airfields every week or so. So his reputation about being this kind of person was well known. Slide, please. When they got to Dessau, they had another funeral. Look at all these German battle flags. This was the official ceremony. The emperor sent a representative. He was buried in the same church where he was baptized in Dessau. Dessau is about 50 miles southwest of Berlin. And we plan to visit there this year. The wing goes there that sends a delegation the 31st wing, sends a delegation there every other year. In 1921, the people of his village erected a huge memorial to him. It looks like an Olympic memorial, about 30 feet high, and there's a park, like a city block park, where this memorial is stationed. And 3 days later, this was the ceremony, the funeral. Slide, please. Now, one of the fellows that he shot down in September of 1916, just a couple, while he was had in Jasta 2, his own squadron, was in a prisoner of war camp, and he requested permission from the commandant to send another wreath, and he and 3 other British pilots sent this wreath. This is the wreath scarf that came with the wreath. It reads, "From the English flyer officers in the Krieg's camp, the prisoner of war camp, in Osnabrück, Belgium, October 28th, the day of his death, the opponent we admired and esteemed so highly." And the fellow had said in a letter to his mother, he said, "It was a great honor for me to be shot down by Oswald Boelcke, and let me tell you how it happened." So, just amazing. Slide, please. This is the airplane. This is the airplane in the museum. This is out on the soccer fields, just across from our house. Maltese cross, of course. Actually, I called it, the Germans corrected me. Not a Maltese cross, it's an Iron Cross. And the squadron commander, when I built the small model, and I took it down to the model shop to show them, I did that, I want to get the paint colors all correct. And I had red, yellow, and black. And one of the old guys said, no, not red, yellow, and black. Yellow didn't come in until the 1930s. It's red, white, and black. Those were the colors of the Empire. And these are the stripes that squadron commanders flew, so their men would recognize that was the airplane of the leader, and when he would give hand signals or other signals, they would know that he was the one in charge. The British and the French did the same thing. The airplane, this is the second model of the Albatross, which, by the way, is the most prolific aircraft manufacturer of the Germans. It's located right on a small airport in Berlin. First airplane with a completely plywood fuselage. They found the plywood fuselage didn't need internal strengthening. It was lighter and stronger than the fabric and internally structured airplanes. There are 2 machine guns I'll show you later, and the left side you can see there is left open, so the kids can see how it was built and how it was put together. Slide, please. This is the airplane in the museum. As I said, it's got this plexiglass case around. This was the early version of the Ordensknisten. Does have the blue max there and the 2 iron crosses and a small picture of Boelcke. This airplane is really magnificent, considering 1916. 160 horsepower Mercedes engine, inline, 6 cylinders, was a more powerful engine than most others of the day. The airplane was faster, I figure about 20 or 30% faster than contemporary French and British airplanes. The left side has 6 coats of marine varnish on it, so it would really show off. And the pilot sitting here is the one Carol was talking about from Britain. All the control cables work. They all work from the stick in the cockpit. There are 3 metal containers here. The front one is the gas tank. They had a main gas tank and an auxiliary emergency backup gas tank, in that time, good thought, and 2 drums for machine gun shells. 2 machine guns built at the Spandau Arsenal, in Berlin. And at the time, you'll recall, the British and the French were still flying with the Lewis gun mounted on the top wing, which they would have to pull down to change the rotary. The cartridges were like old rotary slide projectors, and they held 44 rounds. They eventually made one that held about 90, but most of them had 44 rounds. So you'd fire out in 44 rounds, you'd have to pull the gun down. In some cases, the gunners in British airplanes and the pushers, they'd have to stand up, and because the machine gun was mounted on a stand, they'd have to stand up to take the cartridge off and go down, and they would carry spare cartridges in pockets in the airplane and put it back up, all while you're flying and trying to avoid being shot down. Pretty difficult task. The Germans, on the other hand, in the Albatross, mounted 2 machine guns, fired through the propeller with the synchronizing mechanism that Tony Fokker had invented, and they put 500 rounds for each machine gun. They have 1,000 rounds of ammunition. So it was fast, it was strong, it was powerful, and it was easily the best airplane of 1916.
Valve lifters.
On the model, half my time building the airplane was spent haunting hardware shops for little bitty pieces that would resemble something on the airplane, like a carburetor, or in this case, valve lifters. The valve lifters are springs from a ballpoint pen. Just exactly the right size. The radiator in the top wing, there are 2 models of the D2. The first model had cheek radiators. Now what do you think about cheek radiators, right? If you get a bullet through the radiator is lower than the engine. All the coolant in the engine runs out through the hole in the radiator. So with this, the D2, this is the prototype, they put the radiator in the top wing, made it streamlined, so it doesn't cause any extra drag except this one little thing staying up which kind of pressurizes the air. The tubes in the radiator I made are Starbucks stirring rods, painted silver to represent aluminum, and they had a handle underneath, had little veins underneath, and the pilot had a handle he could open or close the veins to vary the temperature of the fluid. So that's what it looks like. The wheels are handmade, 44 soldered little rods that hold the wheel together like bicycle spokes, slide. So where'd this guy come from? Middle-class family, 4th child. At age 3, he had whooping cough, which gave him asthma throughout life. Can you imagine living in northern France in the snow and rain with asthma? He took himself off flying status 3 different times, and if you look at the list of squadron commanders of JASTA 2, you'll see a guy was a squadron commander for about 1 day. That was the guy who was acting while he was off getting treated for asthma or taking a day off for his treatment. At age 10, his mother must have known that he was precocious, because at age 10, he wrote a letter to the Emperor Wilhelm requesting appointment to one of the military academies without telling his parents. 3 months later, they got an answer back, he'd been admitted. But his mother said, no, 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 not till you finish gymnasium. So he finished high school at about age 19 and then enlisted in the Army. With his asthma, he conducted himself in vigorous sports, swimming, diving, cross-country running, and his father took him when he was 16 on mountain climbing in Bavaria. And he became a daredevil mountain climber. And so all these things to overcome, and I think that's very encouraging for people, young kids, and want to grow up, nothing is easy. You're going to have obstacles in your life, and you need to find a way to overcome those, and then there's nothing that will hold you back. He was on the German Olympic team for the Olympics in 1916, which were going to be held in Berlin. He was going to be in the pentathlon, the 5 events of the pentathlon: running, biking, swimming, and rifle shooting. So quite amazing what he was off as a young kid. Slide, please. He enlisted in the Bavarian Wireless Corps. He was a cadet. He'd done well in high school. He was not a smart student. He liked sports and he liked the mechanical things, but he was not good at the classics. Again, encouraging for most people. He transferred to aviation. In Darmstadt, he saw aviators flying and giving shows, acrobatics off this field. He became in love with aviation. So he applied, and these are the German pilots, Prussian pilot's wing. The crown for the Empire, the wreath, and a Bristol German Taube, means dove, that you know about, which was one of his first airplanes in pilot training, flying over the German countryside. August of 1914. I tell people, I tell kids, if you happen to, if a war happens to occur, go early, because the enemy does not have his air defenses set up as strong as they're going to be later. And I went to the Vietnam War in 1965. I'm glad that I did that. He got his pilot's wing 2 weeks after Germany invaded France and World War I began. So he was right at the beginning. Slide. And after flying 2 or 3 primary airplanes, when Tony Fokker, in fact, if you've read Tony Fokker's autobiography, he had a whale of a difficult time selling his synchronized machine gun. He had to go to 4 different locations. Every time he'd go and he'd demonstrate to the government, he'd say, oh, well, this is very fine and good. Now go to this place and go to this general and get his approval. And then finally they said, go see the general who was in charge of the 6th Army, which was one that Boelcke was in. And they came to the airfield where Boelcke had been, he was the senior pilot. He'd been there longer than anybody. Max Immelman had just joined the squadron and had been there like a couple of weeks when Tony Fokker came to demonstrate the machine gun. When Fokker went back to the factory, he left the Fokker E-1 for Boelcke to fly. And so he did. He flew the first ones, although he got his first victory in a 2-seat airplane in July of 1915. 1915 is known for the day when air combat began, when they started making airplanes explicitly designed for air combat. This is the Fokker E4. Germans had a very simple system. E for Eindecker if it's got 1 wing, D for dry, DR for dry decker if it's got 3 wings, and D for Doppeldecker if it's got 2 wings. So that's their designations. This was the 4th one of the Eindecker, and this one had, they started with the 70 horsepower rotary engine. And anybody who doesn't know about a rotary engine, the propeller is bolted to the engine and the crankshaft is bolted to the airplane. So the propeller goes around only as fast as the engine goes around, which gives tremendous amount of torque. Right turns were really good, left turns were really kind of slow. Well, they thought if one rotary engine is good, on this one, we'll bolt 2 of them together. So they had 2 rotary engines, 140 horsepower, double the horsepower, and they put 2 machine guns on. They tried 3 machine guns, but they could never get the 3rd one synchronized. So they went back to 2, and a lot of Boelcke's late victories were in this airplane one of the things that in some of the appendices, I repeated information that had been published earlier, but one of the things I added to this appendix was to tell the type of airplane that Boelcke was flying when he shot down one of the 40 airplanes that the opponents were flying. Slide, please. I told you about his 7th victim, which was in early January. On the 12th, Oswald Boelcke got his 8th victory, and that meant the Blue Max. And he was, they were sitting at the dining table in the mess, and he got a telephone call. He went and answered the phone call, and he said, "The Emperor has just awarded you the Blue Max." And he's probably the first aviator to be awarded the Blue Max in the German Air Force. And this is what it is. I mentioned why it's blue. You see there's the crown of the empire. The F, anybody know why the F is there?
Frederick.
Frederick the Great initiated the Poilerie in French because the language of the courts and even of Frederick's court was French. And so this is for the merit, and the F is for Frederick the Great. The equivalent in the British Commonwealth of the Victoria Cross and the U.S. Medal of Honor, and it's worn, I don't think the Victoria Cross is worn around the neck, is it? No, just a badge. And this one, like the United States, like the Blue Max, is worn around the neck. And there's a ribbon, with the part that has the stars, the light blue. Any questions so far? Okay, slide please. Now, you can't read World War I aviation books without noticing that there was a culture developed in each of the services, and I have found this to be particularly fascinating. The British were starting off, and they were dominated by Lord Trenchard. And he had the idea of the offensive spirit, which was a good idea. Yeah, but if flying over the enemy lines was offensive, then flying 20 kilometers behind enemy lines was even more offensive. So he pushed his squadrons to have high sortie rates and to fly deep in enemy territory. And of course, with the west wind blowing, that meant many of their airplanes were shot down behind German lines. One of the squadron commanders interpreted that doctrine of the offensive spirit by saying, attack everything. Now, Trenchard also had another dictum, and that was no empty chairs. And that meant that he thought that it was very discouraging to pilots to see empty chairs at the breakfast table of guys who had been shot down the day before, and they had to go off and fly, and they didn't know if their chair would be empty when they came back. This personnel tactic was very vividly described in the movie Flight Commander, starring Douglas Fairbanks Jr., by the way. And so you can imagine the British training system was so primitive that the first pilots through it had no flying training manuals. And the first manual that they gave them was some 40 pages long. Only 2 of those pages were actually about flying the airplane. So they were, so they'd get 10 or 15 hours, and they shipped them off either flying or by boat across the channel. They'd go to St. Omer, where there was the central, not a flying place, but it was a gathering place for incoming pilots. And a lorry would come by about midnight, and he would have the requisition of the squadrons that needed replacement pilots. So he'd say, okay, 3 pilots for this squadron and 2 pilots for that squadron. You guys get on board, bring your kits, and come on board. So this lorry would trundle through the night across these old rutty roads, and he would drop off, 3 guys at this squadron and 2 guys at the next squadron, like 5, 6 in the morning. And these kids, these 18-year-old kids, would report in, "Sir, we're the replacements." And the squadron commander would say, "Well, welcome to 24th Squadron. How much flying time do you have?" "Sir, I have 12 hours. "How much time do you have?" "Sir, I'm the high man. I've got 15 hours. "And what about you?" "Well, I've only got 8 hours, but I'm really eager to go." You say, "Well, you 3 guys sit down here. You 2 high time men, you're going to be on this flight this morning, and you'll unpack your bags when you get back." Many of the young pilots were killed before they ever had a chance to unpack their bags in the squadron. The average length of time of longevity in a squadron in 1916, 1917 was something like 10 to 15 days. Because they were flying every day, sometimes twice a day, and had this tremendous attrition rate. And all that was to maintain the doctrine of no empty chairs. The result is they had high loss rates. 15,000 British and Commonwealth men died in the First World War. 1/2 died in accidents and takeoff or landing. They need overwhelming numbers to win. Fortunately, Britain ramped up both the production of airplanes and the production of pilots, though they had lots of pilots. And when the Americans came over, we kind of overwhelmed them with numbers. I was astounded to find the Germans had a completely different culture, if you will. First of all, in the British, it's kind of an anomaly, and it's not well known, but the Germans dictate tactics to the lowest level. They delegate tactics to the lowest level. A British non-commissioned officer in charge of a tank has more authority to maneuver that tank than some commissioned officers in other services. And in the air, they're authorized to stay with the flight, but to conduct air combat on their own. Oswald Boelcke wrote his dicta, which were the first rules of air combat. 7 different rules, and you've read them, they're in the book. They're the common sense things, and they're not particularly unusual today, but in that day, nobody else had written down what it is you do in the air and how do you survive. And so he wrote down simple things like, try to attack out of the sun. If you attack, follow through, and then, get away. And one of the, I'll give you an example here, and it's in the dicta of Ernst Hartmann, and I'll read it to you because it's really interesting. Dicta Hartmann. Erich Hartmann shot down 352 airplanes in World War II. He's the ace of aces of World War II. And you can say, well, yeah, a lot of them were on the Eastern Front, but the Eastern Front had some pretty good pilots also. So he had the little 4 rules that you do in combat. First of all, see. You have to see your enemy before he sees you. Then you can decide what to do. Secondly, decide. Is it safe to attack? Can you attack and get away with it? You don't have to attack if you're outnumbered. Don't pick a situation that is not favorable to you. 3, attack. Make it swift and merciless. And keep going. Especially with the Eindecker, a lot of their victories were one fire and then straight on through, and it was faster than the British airplanes. They couldn't keep up with it. Finally, number 4. The 4th, and it's a very simple thing, coffee break. If the situation is not right, take a coffee break and come back again the next day. And that's how you survive to get 352 victories and come back. And so that was the main German system. They patrolled primarily on the defensive side, and they were wrong in that. That was a part of their doctrine that they They were sometimes ordered to fly barrier patrols. Can you imagine flying back and forth across the front trying to prevent other airplanes? And that was proven to be a total waste of resources because you don't have enough airplanes and pilots, and you can always get through, especially if the weather is bad. But the results were they had low loss rates, had a high victory count, but they were overwhelmed by numbers in the end. Slide, please. 1916, June. Max Immelman dies in a crash. We still don't know to this day exactly what happened. He may have shot off his own propeller. The engine broke loose and the airplane crashed, and so Boelcke's dead. The Emperor immediately grounded Oswald Boelcke. He didn't want to lose his top 2 flyers in the same month. So he said, and there's a wonderful little, he describes how he was called to the wing headquarters and grounded. He threw a fit. He had been polite to everybody else. He was mad at everybody. How can they do this? How can they ground me? I want to keep flying. And finally, some young ensign said, "Sir, you've got to realize you're a property of the German Empire, and you're too valuable, you know, to be. So get over it and calm down and get back to flying." So they offered him, you can be grounded for an unknown period of time, or you can go on an inspection trip, political trip to Austria and the Ottoman Empire, and that's where he went on. So July and August, early August, he's on this inspection trip. His instructor was flying with the Ottoman Empire. He met him, and he got a tour on the ship that escaped the British blockade, and the Germans turned over to the Turks. He was feted and given a little party, and there's some cute pictures in the network about him swimming with Ottoman girls.
Oh,
And
girls.
yeah, girls. Yeah, in long swimming suits. Yeah. All proper for the time. So, July 1st, the British began the Battle of the Somme. And I could go on and on about the Battle of the Somme, but you know it was one of the worst planned, highest British casualty events of the whole war. And I'll just mention a couple of things about it. We've actually read the orders and the plans for it. First of all, the British had to build railroads up to the lines to bring in all the munitions because they were so heavy, and the Somme was a part that had not had a lot of heavy fighting. The British had only been there for 6 months. The Germans had been on the Somme for a year and a half, and they were well prepared. They had concrete dugouts 40 feet deep and well-positioned places, and so they were really well prepared. So the British philosophy was they were going to, of course, World War I was a war of artillery. Most of the people got killed by artillery shells, not rifle fire from infantry. It was really a tremendous artillery battle. So they were so confident of 6 days of barraging the German lines that they were going to, the barrage would cut all the barbed wire. It would decimate the first 2 lines in the German defenses, and so shock and awe, shock the German defenders that the British men were told to stand up and walk 2 meters apart and walk across no man's land and keep straight lines, please, because these were recruits, and they were more worried about maintaining their own order than in the speed at getting to the German lines. The problem is, what happened was, as soon as the artillery barrage let up, the British men are coming up out of their foxholes, the Germans came up out of their dugouts, manned the machine guns, the barbed wire was not cut, the land was all broken up because of all the artillery shelling, and the British infantry just got mowed down. They lost 30,000 men the first hour and 60,000 men the first day, which is one of the worst disasters in British history. Carol and I were there on July 1st of 1916 because the book had just come out and we were going to go
2016.
2016. That's right. Gray hair comes from flying. And the ceremonies in London to commemorate the Battle of the Somme were truly impressive. They had, all the television had movies of the time, and then they were filming at the Somme Memorial, where a British delegation had gone with the French, and they were televising what those memorials were. So it was very, very sobering. And by the way, we stay at the Royal Air Force Club when we go to London, and we had a room right on Piccadilly, so we could look out. And guess what was forming on July 1st, 2016? The Brexit group. So they had a parade of the Brexit people on this Sunday that we were there. So the British had air superiority. And I try to, and you can probably help me here. You probably have comments. I tried to delineate who had air superiority and how it changed. There really wasn't any air superiority before they mounted guns on the airplane because everybody could do anything they wanted. When the Eindeckers came out, they really had a field day, and the British got quite afraid of the Eindecker airplanes, even though there weren't very many of them, and there never were very many of them. But I would say at that time that the Germans had air superiority because they could go anywhere they wanted. But the Germans didn't improve the Eindecker for over a year. Remember, it was introduced in May of 1915, and here we are at June of 1916, a year later, and the Germans are still flying the Eindecker. And meanwhile, the British had to introduce better airplanes, the de Havilland DH-2 and the FE airplanes were quite good, although boy, they sure look flimsy with those tractor, with the pusher airplanes and the booms out back holding things. That was more of a throwback to the Wright brothers than anything else. But I would say the British had air superiority, but I think the Germans won it back when they introduced the Albatross in September of 1916. Jasta 2, he was formed in September, same airfield as Jasta 1. Boelcke, by the way, let me on his way back from Constantinople, Istanbul, he stops at his brother's squadron on the Eastern Front. His older brother was a squadron commander of a two-seat squadron, and in that squadron was a fellow that Boelcke had met earlier named Manfred von Richthofen. He had met Richthofen on a train to Reichelt, where Boelcke was being reassigned opposite of what was going to become the Battle of Verdun. And Richthofen saw this shy young man and went over and introduced himself and said, "Are you Oswald Boelcke?" This was October of 1915. Boelcke had 5 victories, but he was already famous. And his picture had been in the papers, and Richthofen knew what he looked like. And so he introduced himself. They talked for quite a bit. And he asked Boelcke how he did it. And Boelcke said, "It's very easy. You just fly up very close behind the other airplane, pull the trigger, and he falls down." Richthofen says, "I do the same thing, but he never falls down." So they became friends. He said, "Well, you need to go to pilot training," because Richthofen had chosen to be an observer rather than a pilot. When he came out of the Horse Cavalry, he wanted to fly and said, "Okay, you can be a pilot. It takes 6 months to go through pilot training and you graduate and get your wings. Or you can go to observer training, and that's only 3 weeks." And so, like most young crazy kids, he didn't want to miss the war. So he went to the 3-week course and became an observer. And that's when Boelcke met him. And then later he goes to pilot training. And so he's now a pilot in Boelcke's brother's squadron on the Eastern Front. And Boelcke asked his brother, said, who among your pilots would you recommend for my squadron? Because the Emperor has given me permission to pick whatever pilots I wish. And so his brother recommended two men, one of whom was named Boelcke, who ended up being the one that ran into Boelcke, and the other one was Manfred von Richthofen. So Richthofen recounts it. One morning I'm in my mud hut, and I get this knock on the door, and I open it, there's the great Boelcke. And he asked me to come with him to the Somme. And that's how I started. So von Richthofen reports in late August, and the squadron begins to come together. They only had one airplane, and they eventually it took them 2 weeks to get their airplanes. They had a Fokker D3, not to be confused with the E3, but a double wing, still had a rotary engine. Fokker loved these rotary engines. I mean, they were very reliable. They also gave out castor oil. The lubrication system was castor oil, literally, and it would go through the engine and then be dumped, after it had been through the engine, dumped out. So the pilots are breathing castor oil, and it's coming off the engine while they're trying to fly. Of course, it makes them sick, one of the adverse things of it. So he gets his pilot, and they've got a couple airplanes now. Boelcke flies a mission in dawn, in the day, comes back, and he trains his men. Remember, he'd just written the Boelcke Dicta, and he trains them on assembling and disassembling machine guns, firing the machine gun on the range, on the ground, looking at the machine gun on the in the airplane, teaching them navigation, tactics, formation flying, because these guys this was all new to them, flying combat. So for 2 weeks, he wouldn't let any of them fly while they attended his ground school, and he flew off and got 7 victories between the 2nd and the 15th of September. But he trained his men, kind of different than keeping no empty chairs at the breakfast table and making the young guys go off and fly before they were ever oriented in theater. Even in Vietnam, when I got there, I was very eager to fly it. I got there the 25th of January, 1965, and I was so frustrated they wouldn't let me fly right away. They said, look, when you get checked out, you're going to be flying every day, so now just take a couple days and get oriented. And then I had to check out for 2 or 3 flights, so you get to know the local area, get to know the milestones, what things look like, where the villages are, where the VC is likely to be, and then you get to fly. And then I flew 100 missions the first 90 days. And that's important because then you get to go to Hong Kong. So he trains his guys. The Ds arrive on the 17th of April. 1 D2 and I think 6 D1s. And they were virtually the same. He had the prototype of the D2, which didn't have the cheap radiators, but had it up in the top wing, even though the other D2s had the lower radiators. So he had a really good airplane. So he gets his first flight together. It took 4 pilots and himself. Richthofen was in the flight, Boelcke was in the flight, and his other guys. That flight of 5 guys shot down four British airplanes, and a guy from another squadron shot down another airplane. So they had 5 of them. That very first day they flew combat, and that was and they went on from there. That squadron ended World War I with 25 aces, 336 victories from the late 1916 through. So we just flew for 2 years, 2 years out of the war, 336. There was second highest scoring German squadron. The top scoring one was Richthofen's squadron. He was transferred in December after Boelcke was killed. He was transferred in December to JASA 11, and 11 became then the highest scoring squadron. slide. Here are his victories in October. A single on the first, his fourth double on the 62 airplanes in one day, his fifth double on the 22nd, and his last victory, number 40, on the 26th of October. And here's what I like to tell my audiences. When Manfred von Richthofen got his first victory on September 17, 1916, Boelcke got his 26th. So that shows the relationship of the teacher-student. And Boelcke became known as a great teacher. Not only had he written the dicta, but he trained his men, and that legacy is one of the things that he's known for to this day. Slide, please. This is a shot taken just before his last flight. Here you can see the D2, October 28, 1916. This is the symbol of the squadron, Jasta 2. You see the Pour la Marie, the blue max up there, and it's got Boelcke. 3 weeks after Boelcke was killed, the Emperor renamed the squadron from Jasta 2 to Jasta Boelcke. So in the record books and in the books that you see of the British pilots, his is not listed as Jasta 2, it's Jasta B, just the B. And there were very few squadrons that had that. Now this leads to 2 pilot aphorisms. Of course, he's flying the D2 airplane, so the first pilot aphorism that is true today: don't ever fly the A model of anything. Don't buy the first model of the new car, because they're going to find things wrong with it, and you'll benefit from the corrections that they made. And the second aphorism is not as well known, but it is: don't have your picture taken just before you go fly. Wait till you come back on a day when you're not flying. So he goes off. They meet 24 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps, and as I mentioned, they're stacked up. They start to maneuver. Boelcke turns left. Okay, so he's dead on that day, October 28th. Slide. At home in the cockpit. This is not the D2. It's one of the other Albatross, but I thought it's the best shot of him in the cockpit. Died when he was 25 years old. Max Emmelmann died when he was 25 years old. Manfred von Richthofen, 18 months later, died when he was 25 years old. When I was 25 years old, I was flying combat in Vietnam. I was glad to get to 26. Young men, slide. Slide, please.
Excuse me. RJ, your book mentions that's the last photo of him. Is that's the aircraft he was shot down in?
May not be technically correct.
Oh, okay.
May not be the last, but it was rumored to be the last photo. Okay, slide please. Now, one of the things I wanted to rewrite, I wanted to do research, and I had done research. Really, what was his legacy? How famous was he? Did we know about him in the United States? I found this. First of all, I found 186 references to Oswald Boelcke in American newspapers. Starting when he won the Blue Max in January of 1916, that was the first set of, it was a burst of things in American newspapers. Then there was a little more when Immelman was killed. There was a little more in his death. And then about every 10 years, there were more articles. Yes?
RJ, you know, in Australia, we've got a newspaper database that the government has, the National Library. And you can find a reference to Boelcke in 1915.
Yes.
And the news was that the German press releases had previously talked about Field Marshal doing this and General doing that. And the Imperial press release said Oswald Boelcke shot down an aircraft.
Yes.
And that was news even in Britain and news here in Australia.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. We're not so centralized in the U.S., so every newspaper has its own database. But that's, you're right. And people on the home front, you know, they longed for it. It was so, flying was so much different than death in the trenches. I think it just gave, plus the whole aviation, that's why we're, what kind of historians? Aviation historians. You know, we love that. I started flying when I was 15 years old, and I got caught up in all that. It's just absolutely fantastic. Look who the author of this article is. These were like Ripley's Believe It or Not. Remember 1935? Some kid named E.V. Rickenbacker was, of course, the race car driver who became General Pershing's aide and then a pilot and the ace of, top ace in the United States with 26 victories. Oswald Boelcke, one of the most famous of the earlier German aces, the son of a Saxon schoolmaster, learned to fly at the Halberstadt Flying School. By May 1916, he had downed 16 planes. The German High Command had forbidden him to fly, as his experience in the air war was invaluable, but he continued until his death when his score had reached 40. And down here, among friend or foe, Boelcke had a reputation for bravery and chivalry. He devoted many of his rest hours to visiting wounded men he had brought down. And he would do it. He would take a basket of wine and cheese and bread and go visit these men. And the stories of the guys that got shot down that weren't wounded, he invited back to the squadron for beer and schnapps. And the live go out and said, go look at our airplanes. And then, by the way, go off to prison camp. But I mean, what kind of a guy? It's just amazing to me, everything that Carol and I learned about it. Slide, please. So, other people remembered as well. This is in a little town in France where he went down. The second year we went back in October of 1916, exactly on the 100th anniversary of his death, the German wing commander did not ask permission, but wrote the mayor of Baupum, the mayor standing here. He said, I would like to bring a delegation from our wing over and honor Oswald Boelcke on this anniversary of his death, 100th anniversary. And the mayor said, hey, that's a great idea. He said, I'm a member of parliament. I have a little money from the parliament to put on a ceremony. We'll include Georges Guynemer from the French Air Force, and we'll bring the British Major Hawker, and we'll have a little three-nation get-together. They had a 3-day ceremony. They had children from the elementary school out performing a dance number with flags right in the city square, and they erected a huge boulder with a Boelcke plaque on it. And all these men, all these NATO members, either Australian Army, French Navy, French Army, French Air Force, political person, the German wing commander, the attaché from the German embassy, and the German Luftwaffe band, about 150 people in the band, and they played. This was really meaningful. Carol and I were just so happy to be invited. They played not only the 3 national anthems, but the 3, I don't even know what you call them, the funeral songs for the 3 different services. In Britain, it was Last Post, and in German, I Had a Comrade, which again was inaugurated back in the Napoleonic Wars, and is the official German thing. You look it up on YouTube, very meaningful thing. It had nothing to do with Nazism, but quite meaningful. And in France, I forget the name, but the French have a similar song when they bury their heroes. So this was amazing to us. And all these brothers in arms. This is the wing. It's named Tactical Wing 31. It's just outside of Cologne in a little village called Norvenich. And they now fly the Eurofighter Typhoon. Britain, Germany, and I think either Italy or Spain fly the Typhoon airplane. And this is the Boelcke, this is the wing's symbol that they gave me this symbol. Carol and I spoke there. We gave a version of this talk. We've been invited to speak there twice. They have a Boelcke museum there. If you ever get to Cologne, it's on the base, but you can go see it, and they have a lot of memorabilia and kind of his archives and many of the photos that we have in the book we got from their archives. Wonderful. Slide, almost done. Oh, so his legacy. What is the important? First of all, not his exploits, but his character is what is remembered. Is being such a person to be modeled after. The emperor named the squadron Oswald Boelcke. Generals and civilians, we read his funeral orations, and his boss at the wing commander said, every young boy in Germany now says, I want to be a Boelcke. A tremendous influence. In fact, in German Air Force, the public, there are 4 German Air Force wings, fighter wings, that have the names of their named wings. Of all the units they have, there are 4 named. Richthofen wing, the Immelmann wing, the Boelcke wing, and the, I forget the name, but it's one from World War II, the general who was the chief of staff of the German Air Force when they entered NATO in 1959. And he had been a Messerschmitt pilot in World War II, and he was famous because he kept refusing Hitler's orders. He would do his own thing, and he'd get grounded, and then they'd bring him back, and he'd get grounded again for, not being a Nazi. And he's the only one that's not a World War I ace, so it's quite an honor to be there. His funeral was publicized worldwide. His father released his letters. The first thing I read by him was the Aviator's Field Book. There are 2 versions that are published. The field book was published by his father right after he died, and that contains only his letters during World War I, during the 2 years of the war. The larger book, it was written in 1931, and it goes back and publishes some of his letters. His family apparently kept all of his letters, and he wrote about every 3 days, primarily to calm his mother down, because she was very worried about his health. But the longer book includes the letters and his pre-war life. 1921, I mentioned his hometown erects this memorial. I said every year the wing goes. One year they go to Dessau with a deputation to honor him there, and the other year, the odd year, they go to Bapum to the memorial for the place that he fell. So it's an honor. In 1935, there was a medium bomber wing that was named Boelcke, but since 1961, this wing has been named Boelcke. Slide, please. And that's it. That's the actual airplane. That's the D2, a rebuilt model of the airplane in flight.
Perhaps we might.
I think it's good now. Coffee, anyone?
Break for coffee and
Everyone have some questions.
then we'll go to questions.
Wonderful. Good. Well, did you get some of that?
Yes.
I hope everybody got a book. Anybody else need one signed?
Oh, hello.
Don't forget,
My
last
name's
chance
Eric.
to buy a book.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, I don't
They're
know
just
where.
here.
Yeah, I'm not sure who's taking up the money.
Gordon is Mr.
Oh, you are,
Nice
okay.
man.
Because there've been a lot of others. Yeah, he died after 50, 50. Yeah.
Pineapple. Right, I think what we call them, those words. Yellow is pineapple.